Right now, as you settle in, as your eyes get heavy and the room goes quiet, you're living on top of a graveyard. Not a graveyard of bodies, but a graveyard of entire worlds. According to the people who built pyramids, taller than some of our modern buildings, who tracked the stars with a precision that still confuses astronomers today, the world you know, the sun above you, the ground beneath you, is not the first attempt at creation. It's not even the second or third, it's the fifth. 4 other worlds existed before this one. 4 other suns rose and set over 4 other versions of reality, and every single one of them was destroyed, wiped away completely. Not by accident, not randomly, but as part of a pattern, a cosmic rhythm that the Aztecs and the Nahua people before them believed governed everything. Creation, destruction, creation again. Think about that for a moment. Imagine believing, truly believing, that the ground beneath your feet was built on the ashes of a civilization of giants who came before you. Imagine looking up at the sun each morning, knowing that it wasn't the first sun, that 3 others had burned in the sky before it, and all 3 had gone dark. That's not just mythology, that's an entire worldview built around the idea that nothing lasts forever. Not even reality itself. If you're settling in to drift off tonight, that's exactly why I make these. So, if you want, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right there. I love checking these in the morning. Someone's in Tokyo just waking up. Someone's in Chicago and it's the middle of the night. Someone's in Lisbon just starting their evening. All of you drifting towards sleep or waking toward your day at the exact same moment, listening to the same story about worlds that ended long ago. And if you want to support the show, the easiest way is to follow along on Spotify. There's a link right down in the description. It costs nothing. It takes 10 seconds, and it genuinely helps keep these stories coming. Now, back to those 4 lost worlds. The Aztecs called them suns, but not in the way we think of the sun today. Each sun was an entire age, an entire era of creation, with its own sky, its own rules, its own kind of humanity living beneath it. The Nahua people, the broader cultural and linguistic group the Aztecs belonged to, believed time didn't move in a straight line the way we imagine it. It moved in circles, ages rose, flourished and collapsed, only to be followed by new ages built from the wreckage of the old ones. Each of those 4 earlier worlds ended in catastrophe. One was destroyed by something in the sky. One was torn apart by wind so powerful it reduced people to nothing. One drowned in fire and ash raining down from above. One was swallowed by water so complete it erased almost everyone who lived beneath that particular sun. 4 different disasters, 4 different endings, and after each one, the gods had to start over, had to remake the world, remake humanity, and try again. We are, according to this belief system, living under the 5th attempt. The current sun, the one warming the earth right now, is called Nahui-Ollin, the sun of movement. And here's the unsettling part. The Aztecs believed this 5th world would end too. Someday. Somehow, just like all the others. But before we get to how this world might end, we need to understand how the first 4 worlds died. What destroyed them? What reset actually meant to the people who told these stories? Because buried inside these myths, layered underneath the gods and the giants and the floods, there might be something else entirely. Real memories, real disasters, real history, dressed up in the language of legend. So relax, let your breathing slow, and let's go back to the very beginning, to the first sun and the strange giant-filled world that came before ours. To understand how a world dies, we first have to understand how the people who told these stories saw the universe itself, because the Nahua worldview wasn't built like ours. We tend to think of history as a line, a beginning, a middle, and an end still coming. They thought of it as a wheel, something that turns and turns, crushing whatever came before, then rolling forward into something new, only to eventually crush that too. This wasn't a side detail in their religion. This was the foundation. The bedrock belief underneath everything else the Aztecs and the broader Nahua peoples understood about existence. Creation wasn't a single event that happened once, long ago, and then settled into permanence. Creation was a process, ongoing, repeating, unfinished. The gods didn't build a universe and walk away satisfied. They built one, watched it fail, tore down the wreckage, and tried again. And again, and again. Each attempt was called a sun. And this is where things get interesting, because when we hear that word sun, we picture the giant ball of burning gas that rises every morning and sets every evening. But that's not quite what the Nahua meant. A sun in this cosmology wasn't just the literal light in the sky. It was an entire era, an entire configuration of reality. The sun overhead was simply the symbol, the visible sign, that a particular version of the world was currently running. When the sun changed, everything changed with it. The physical laws, the type of beings who walked the earth, the rules governing life and death. A new sun meant a new universe, wearing new skin. Each of these eras had its own ruling god, a deity whose personality and power defined the nature of that particular age. And each age, without exception, ended in catastrophe. Not gently, not through peaceful transition, through disaster. Something arrived, something inevitable, and undid everything that had been built. The people living under that sun, whatever strange or half-formed version of humanity happened to exist at the time, were destroyed along with it. Wiped from the record almost entirely, except for the fragments the gods chose to preserve, seeds for whatever came next. This is important to sit with for a moment, because this wasn't a universe designed to last. It was a universe designed to fail over and over as part of its basic operating structure. Permanence wasn't the goal. Permanence wasn't even possible. Impermanence was built into the architecture of existence itself. And if you were Nahua, if you grew up hearing these stories from your parents, your grandparents, your priests, you didn't experience this as some abstract theological curiosity. You experienced it as a lived truth. The world you were standing on had already ended 4 times, and the version you were currently living in, breathing in, raising your children in, would end too. Someday. The only real question was when and how. Now, where do we actually get these stories? How do we know any of this? The truth is, this cosmology survives to us today through a small handful of colonial-era documents, written down after the Spanish conquest, often by Nahua scribes working alongside Spanish friars, who were trying, in their own way, to record a worldview they were simultaneously trying to erase. It's a strange, layered kind of survival. Stories that existed for centuries as oral tradition, as painted codices, as sculpture and stone, filtered through the lens of conquest and Christianity, and somehow still recognizable underneath it all. The Codex Chimalpopoca is one of the most important sources, a collection of Nahuatl language texts that includes the legend of the suns, one of the clearest surviving accounts of these cosmic ages and their destructions. Then there's the Florentine Codex, an enormous, almost encyclopedic work compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, working with Nahua scholars who recorded their own history, religion, and daily life in exhaustive, often startlingly vivid detail. And there's the Historia de los Mexicanos por sus Pinturas, a Spanish-language account believed to be based on now-lost pictorial manuscripts, painted books that once held these stories in image form before the physical books themselves were destroyed or simply crumbled away with time. These sources don't always agree with each other. The order of the suns shifts slightly depending on which document you're reading. The specific disaster attached to each age sometimes varies. Even the names of the ruling gods aren't always consistent. This isn't a flaw in the mythology, it's a reminder that we're looking at a living oral tradition, one that existed in multiple regional variations across centuries, only some of which happened to survive being written down at all. What we're piecing together tonight is closer to a mosaic than a single unbroken photograph. Beautiful, but with certain edges deliberately left blurry by time itself. Still, across these sources a pattern holds. 4 suns before ours. 4 gods who ruled. 4 catastrophic endings. And that pattern is what we're going to follow tonight, one age at a time. We'll meet the first sun, ruled over by a fierce and jealous god, populated by giants who lived a strange, doomed kind of existence. We'll watch the second sun collapse under wind so violent it stripped humanity down to almost nothing. We'll see the third sun burn under a rain of fire. We'll watch the fourth sun drown beneath a flood, so total it nearly erased the world a second time. And then in the silence after all 4 failures, we'll sit in the darkness with the gods themselves, in the moment when there was no sun at all, and the universe waited to see if anyone would have the courage to become one. There's something worth noticing here before we even begin. A civilization capable of extraordinary achievement, of astronomy precise enough to track Venus across centuries, of architecture that still stands after 1,000 years of wind and rain, built its entire understanding of reality around the idea that nothing lasts. Not the sun, not the sky, not even the ground beneath your feet. Everything ends, everything is temporary, and somehow, knowing that, they kept building anyway. So let's return to where all of this started. The very first attempt. The first sun and the giants who lived and died beneath it. The first age was called Nahui-Ollin, 4 jaguar. And from the very name, you can already feel something unsettling about this era, because the number 4 in Nahua cosmology wasn't just a count. It carried weight. It signified completeness, but also inevitability. The 4 directions, the 4 colours, the 4 previous worlds. When a sun was named with the number 4, it meant that era's fate was already sealed, written into its foundation from the moment it began. The jaguar part, that was the seal itself. The mechanism of destruction waiting patiently inside the architecture of this world, like a trigger set to go off. And who was the god presiding over this first fragile attempt at a functioning universe? Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. If you want to understand what went wrong with the first sun, you have to understand the deity who built it, because Tezcatlipoca was never going to produce a stable world. He wasn't that kind of god. He was, depending on how you approach him, the most powerful and the most dangerous deity in the entire Nahua pantheon. A god of night and sorcery, a god of fate and fortune, both the giving and the taking away. A trickster whose tricks weren't playful, they were cosmic. He carried a mirror of obsidian on his chest, a smoking mirror that showed him everything happening across the world, every hidden act, every secret thought. Nothing escaped his sight, and he used what he saw to manipulate, to disrupt, to keep the universe in a state of constant, unpredictable motion. He was also missing a foot. In some versions of the mythology, he tore it off himself as sacrifice during the creation of the world. In others, it was bitten away by a monstrous earth creature, when he and his rival god Quetzalcoatl were tearing apart the primordial sea monster, Cipactli, to build the land from her body. Either way, where his foot should have been, there was only a smoking obsidian mirror, or sometimes a bone, or sometimes nothing at all, just an absence that he concealed by walking with a jaguar's leg. This missing foot matters because it tells us something essential about Tezcatlipoca. He was incomplete. He was a god of imperfection, of brokenness, of the inevitable flaw in any system. And he ruled the first sun. So what kind of world did a trickster god of fate and imperfection produce? A strange one. The beings who lived under this first sun were not humans like us. They were giants. The sources call them Nanahuatzin. Enormous beings who walked the earth during this inaugural age, and the mythology is surprisingly specific about them. These giants were so tall that they could pull down trees with their bare hands. They didn't use tools, or at least none that the stories preserve for us. They simply relied on their raw physical power to survive in a world that was, in many versions of the account, still half-formed, still rough and unfinished, like a pot pulled from the kiln before the glaze has properly set. Tezcatlipoca's world was one of brute strength and little refinement. The giants lived, they walked, they ate, but they didn't build. They didn't create, they simply existed, taking up space in an era that seemed to be waiting for something else to arrive. And how long did this world last? The numbers are staggering. The Codex Chimalpopoca gives the duration of the first sun as 676 years. That's 13 cycles of 52 years each, which is significant, because 52 was the basic unit of cosmic time in Nahua reckoning, the length of a full calendar round. So this era lasted precisely 13 of these rounds, a complete and orderly span by their mathematical standards. But order and stability aren't the same thing. The first sun was orderly in its structure, perhaps, but it was never stable because it was built on the foundation of a god whose very nature was disruption. And then the end came, the destruction that had been written into the name from the start, Nahui-Ollin, 4 jaguar. The jaguars came down from the sky, or perhaps they emerged from the earth itself. The sources vary on the exact mechanism, but the result is consistent across every version of the story. Jaguars devoured the giants, not a gradual decline, not a slow weakening of their world over generations, a sudden, overwhelming consumption. The most powerful predators in the Mesoamerican landscape, the creatures that embodied raw, killing force, descended upon these enormous beings and tore them apart. The giants, who could pull down trees with their hands, who dominated the physical world through sheer size and strength, were eaten by jaguars. Their era ended not with a whimper, but with teeth. Why jaguars? To answer that, we have to step into the symbolic world of Mesoamerican culture, where the jaguar was never just an animal. It was a force. It was night. It was the earth. It was the power that lurked in darkness and in the forest, the power that moved unseen and struck without warning. Jaguars were associated with the underworld, with the realm of death and transformation, with the god Tezcatlipoca himself. Remember, he concealed his missing foot with a jaguar's limb. The jaguar was his creature, his avatar, his instrument. So when the first sun ended with jaguars consuming the inhabitants of that world, it wasn't just a natural disaster in mythological clothing. It was Tezcatlipoca's own nature turning back upon his creation. The trickster god of disruption had built a world that could only be destroyed by the very force he represented. The jaguar was the disruption made flesh, the inevitability encoded in the system from the start. But there's another layer here, something that resonates with how later Mesoamerican cultures understood power itself. In the symbolic language that developed over centuries, jaguars were associated with rulers, with warriors, with the elite classes who dominated through force and intimidation. The Olmecs, centuries before the Aztecs, had already developed an elaborate iconography of jaguars, half-human, half-cat figures, that scholars believe represented shamans or rulers undergoing transformation, accessing the raw power of the predator. So the destruction of the first sun by jaguars carries an echo of a deeper insight, that a world built on brute force alone, a world ruled by the logic of the predator, will eventually be consumed by predators. The giants pulled down trees with their hands and nothing more. They had no craft, no culture, no refinement, and in the end, something stronger and more cunning came for them. That's not just a myth, that's an observation about how power operates in the real world. Now, what actual experience might have seeded this story? That's where things get speculative, but worth considering. Some scholars have suggested that the race of giants could reflect an ancestral memory of megafauna, the enormous animals that roamed Mesoamerica during the Pleistocene. Mastodons, giant ground sloths, huge relatives of the armadillo and the bear. These creatures would have been encountered by early human populations moving into the region, and their eventual extinction, possibly driven by human hunting alongside climate change, could have been preserved in oral tradition over thousands of years, gradually transformed from memory of giant animals into memory of giant people. Others have pointed out that the jaguar itself was the apex predator of the Mesoamerican ecosystem, the creature that early humans feared most in the forest. A world-ending cataclysm involving jaguars might encode the primal terror of the wild, the understanding that nature's power could overwhelm anything human beings could build. There's also a possibility that the myth preserves cultural memory of a real catastrophe. The period around 676 years, the 13 cycles of 52, might correspond to some actual interval of destruction that early Nahua communities experienced or inherited from predecessor cultures. Volcanic eruptions in the Valley of Mexico, seismic events that reshaped the landscape, droughts that brought civilization to its knees. The jaguar as destruction could be metaphor, the wild force of nature wearing the face of the forest's most dangerous inhabitant. But we can't say any of this with certainty. We can only note that the myth feels like it's carrying something older than itself, something that remembers a time when the world broke and the powerful were consumed. What we can say with certainty is what the myth meant to the people who told it. The first sun taught that a world built by a trickster, governed by imperfection, populated by beings who relied only on strength, would inevitably fall. The mechanism of its destruction was already embedded in its name, and the next god, watching this failure, would try to build something different, something better. But as we'll see, better didn't mean lasting. Nothing ever meant lasting, but before we move to the second attempt at building a world, we need to understand the force that would oppose Tezcatlipoca in every age to come. Because the destruction of the first sun wasn't just the end of an era. It was the opening move in a cosmic rivalry that would shape the entire history of the universe, playing out across all 5 suns, echoing through every creation and every cataclysm. And the other player in this game was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. If Tezcatlipoca was the god of disruption, the broken mirror reflecting the world's flaws, Quetzalcoatl was his opposite in almost every way that mattered. He was a god of creation, of order, of knowledge, a deity associated with wind, with learning, with the crafts that transform raw material into something refined and useful. Where Tezcatlipoca ruled the night and the unseen, Quetzalcoatl moved with the dawn and the breath of life. His serpent body carried him through the air, and his feathers, the plumage of the Quetzal bird, marked him as something that had transcended the earth, a creature of both ground and sky, of both the crawling ancient wisdom of serpents and the soaring freedom of birds. This duality wasn't accidental. It was the core of who he was. A god who existed between states, who bridged opposites, who could see the value in transformation itself. And he hated what Tezcatlipoca had built. Or perhaps hated is too simple a word. He opposed it. He found it inadequate. The first sun, with its giants pulling down trees, its brute force existence, its lack of art or culture or craft, offended Quetzalcoatl's sense of what a world should be. He was a creator god. He believed in making things, in shaping clay into pottery, in weaving fibers into cloth, in turning raw stone into tools with purpose and design. A world where the inhabitants merely existed, where they took up space without contributing meaning, was a failed experiment from Quetzalcoatl's perspective. And when Tezcatlipoca's jaguars consumed that world, Quetzalcoatl saw an opportunity to try again, to build something better. But here's the crucial thing to understand about this rivalry. It wasn't a simple conflict between good and evil. That framing, which has persisted since the Spanish arrived and immediately tried to map Christian theology onto Nahua cosmology, misses the fundamental nature of what was happening between these two gods. Tezcatlipoca wasn't evil, he was necessary. Quetzalcoatl wasn't pure. He was flawed in his own ways, rigid where Tezcatlipoca was fluid, obsessed with order to the point where his creations could become brittle, fragile, unable to adapt when the inevitable disruption arrived. Their rivalry wasn't a battle between light and darkness. In the moral sense, we often use those terms. It was the tension between two cosmic principles that both had to exist for the universe to function at all. Order needs chaos to prevent stagnation. Chaos needs order to have something to disrupt. Without Tezcatlipoca's interventions, Quetzalcoatl's worlds would calcify, becoming so rigid and controlled that they couldn't respond to change, couldn't grow, couldn't evolve. Without Quetzalcoatl's attempts at creation, Tezcatlipoca would have nothing to work with, no structure to test, no system to reveal the flaws in. They were interdependent antagonists, locked in a cycle of creation and destruction that wasn't meant to have a winner, because winning would mean the universe itself had stopped functioning. This is duality in the Nahua sense, not a battle between opposed moral forces, but a dynamic, necessary tension between complementary principles. Life and death, growth and decay, building and unbuilding. Neither can exist without the other. Neither should ever fully defeat the other. And this cosmic pattern may have mirrored something very real in the political landscape of Mesoamerica. Some scholars have proposed that the rivalry between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl reflects, or at least resonates with, actual tensions between different priesthoods and ruling factions within Nahua societies. Tezcatlipoca was the patron deity of the ruling elite, of warriors, of the power that maintained itself through force and intimidation and the manipulation of fate. His cult was associated with the night, with secrecy, with the kind of authority that doesn't need to explain itself. Quetzalcoatl's following, by contrast, seems to have been connected to priestly castes focused on learning, on calendar keeping, on the preservation and transmission of knowledge. In some tellings, Quetzalcoatl himself was a priest king, a figure who ruled through wisdom rather than warfare. These two power structures, the warrior aristocracy and the priestly intelligentsia, existed in real tension within Aztec society and within the societies that preceded them. The mythological rivalry between their patron gods might have been both a reflection of that real-world conflict and a way of making sense of it, encoding it in cosmic terms so that political struggle could be understood as part of the universe's fundamental architecture. When Tezcatlipoca overthrew Quetzalcoatl's creations, it wasn't just a god acting against another god. It was the principle of force disrupting the principle of order, the warrior ethos triumphing over the priestly one, or perhaps the necessary correction that prevented any single mode of power from dominating permanently. We can't say this with certainty. The connection between myth and politics is always interpretive, always working backward from story to social structure. But the resonance is striking, and it suggests that the Five Suns narrative wasn't just abstract cosmology. It was also a way of thinking about how power works, how it fails, how it gets replaced. What we can say with certainty is that this rivalry would repeat. Every sun that followed, every new attempt at building a world would be shaped by the tension between these two forces. Quetzalcoatl would create, Tezcatlipoca would disrupt, The cycle would continue because neither god could ever truly win, and neither god could ever stop trying. And the next world, the second sun, would be Quetzalcoatl's first real attempt at doing things differently, at building something that could withstand the smoking mirror's inevitable interference. It would not succeed, but it would be a different kind of failure, a failure that revealed new truths about what a world needs to survive and what it can never have. So Quetzalcoatl took his turn. The feathered serpent became the sun, and the second sun, called Nahui-Ollin, Forewind, began. And at first it seemed like he had learned from the mistakes of the first sun. Quetzalcoatl was a god of craft, of intellect, of deliberate shaping. He didn't want brute force giants stumbling through a world of raw consumption. He wanted something more refined, more agile, more capable of the kind of cultural complexity he valued above all else. So the inhabitants of this new age were smaller, quicker, more clever. They were still human in form or something close to it, but they were designed for a world where speed and adaptability mattered more than sheer strength, where you needed to be able to climb, to swing, to move through a landscape that Quetzalcoatl had shaped to reward precisely those qualities. And for a time it worked. The world of Forewind was greener, more varied, less dominated by the endless consumption that had characterized Tezcatlipoca's age. Quetzalcoatl's humans built things. They developed social structures, they learned to work together, they began to approach something that looked like the kind of civilization the feathered serpent wanted to see. But the flaw was already there, woven into the very fabric of this creation, and it had to do with the element that gave the age its name. Wind, in Nahua thought. Wind wasn't just moving air. Here cattle was one of the fundamental forces of the cosmos, and it carried multiple meanings that layered over each other in ways that made it both powerful and unstable. Wind was breath. It was the force that animated living things, the literal air that passed through human bodies and gave them speech, gave them song, gave them the capacity to communicate and create. Quetzalcoatl himself was a wind god. Ihecatl Quetzalcoatl, the aspect of the feathered serpent that moved unseen through the world, carrying seeds, carrying sounds, carrying the invisible connections that linked separate communities into something larger. Wind was also change, the capacity for transformation, for movement from one state to another. This was what made it sacred and what made it dangerous. Because the same force that carried breath and song could also carry destruction. The same wind that scattered seeds for new growth could scatter entire communities, rip roofs from houses, flatten forests, turn the ordered world Quetzalcoatl had built into chaos in an instant. Wind was never stable. It was always in motion, always shifting, always capable of becoming something else without warning. And this instability, this inherent tendency towards sudden and overwhelming transformation, was the seed of the second sun's destruction. The story goes that as this age progressed, the people of Forewind grew complacent. They had been designed for agility, for cleverness, for the kind of social cooperation that Quetzalcoatl valued. But over time, they stopped living up to their design. They became less careful, less attentive to the maintenance of their world. Some versions of the myth say they forgot their creator, stopped performing the rituals that sustained the cosmic order, became absorbed in their own pursuits and pleasures. Others say they simply failed to develop the moral and cultural depth that Quetzalcoatl had hoped for. They were clever but not wise, quick but not thoughtful, capable of building but not of building anything that lasted. And this failure, this gap between what they were meant to be and what they actually became, opened the space for Tezcatlipoca's intervention. He didn't need jaguars this time. He didn't need to summon monstrous beasts from the underworld. He just needed to amplify what was already present. The wind that was the essence of this age, the fundamental force that Quetzalcoatl had built his world around, turned against that world with devastating fury. The hurricanes came. Not just strong storms, but cosmic hurricanes, winds that transcended anything the physical world could produce on its own. They tore across the landscape with a force that shattered every structure Quetzalcoatl's humans had built, flattened every forest, scattered every community. The destruction was absolute, but it was also, in its own terrible way, appropriate. A world built on wind was destroyed by wind. A creation whose fundamental principle was instability was undone by the very instability that made it possible. The order that Quetzalcoatl had imposed was revealed as fragile, unable to withstand the full expression of the force that underlay it. And here we see one of the most fascinating and unsettling patterns in the Five Suns narrative. The destruction of each age is connected to its essence. Jaguars destroy the world of giants. Wind destroys the world of wind. Rain and fire destroy the world of rain. Water destroys the world of water. The element that defines an age also contains its doom. This isn't arbitrary, it's a profound observation about the nature of systems. The thing that makes a world what it is, its foundational principle, its organizing force, is also the thing that can most completely undo it when that force shifts from constructive to destructive expression. But the end of the second sun also reveals another pattern that runs through the Five Suns, one that's often overlooked because the catastrophes are so dramatic. Humanity wasn't annihilated. Quetzalcoatl's humans didn't simply die. They were transformed when the hurricanes reached their peak. When the wind was tearing apart everything the people of Four Wind had built, they didn't vanish into nothing. They became monkeys. This transformation is strange and specific, and it has multiple layers of meaning. Monkeys are agile, quick, clever, capable of moving through complex environments with remarkable skill. In other words, they possess exactly the qualities Quetzalcoatl designed his humans to have, but in a reduced, purely physical form, stripped of the cultural depth, the ritual knowledge, the moral complexity that the feathered serpent had hoped they would develop. The transformation into monkeys wasn't random punishment. It was a demotion, a reduction of humanity to its most basic survival traits, the ones that had been built into their design from the beginning, while stripping away everything they had failed to build on top of those traits. They kept their agility, they kept their cleverness. They lost everything that made those qualities meaningful. This pattern, humanity being reduced rather than destroyed, repeats across the suns. Giants become jaguars, humans become monkeys, later humans become dogs or turkeys or fish. Each transformation takes the essential physical characteristics of that age's people and distills them into an animal form that embodies those traits without the cultural overlay that was supposed to give them purpose. It's a form of survival, but it's also a judgment. A statement that what you were physically was preserved, but what you were supposed to become culturally was lost. The raw material survived, the refinement didn't, and Quetzalcoatl, watching his humans scramble through the ruins of his world as monkeys, swinging from broken branches, chittering instead of speaking, had to confront the fact that his second attempt had failed in a fundamentally different way than Tezcatlipoca's first. The first sun ended because its people were too brute, too simple, too focused on raw consumption. The second sun ended because its people were too unstable, too prone to the kind of sudden sweeping change that wind represents. Too clever to be destroyed by simple violence, but not wise enough to build something that could withstand their own essential nature. And this failure, this specific and instructive failure, would shape everything that came next. Because the gods were learning, each catastrophe revealed something about what a world needed to survive, and what it couldn't have. Strength without culture led to jaguar destruction. Agility without stability led to hurricane annihilation. The next attempt would need to find a balance between these poles, to build humans who were strong enough to endure, but grounded enough to persist. But finding that balance would prove far harder than anyone expected. So the gods tried again. Quetzalcoatl had proven that agility without stability led to annihilation. Tezcatlipoca had shown that brute strength without culture led to mindless consumption ending in jaguar jaws. The next attempt needed something different. Something that could ground a world, give it weight and consistency, make it fertile and productive, rather than merely fast or merely strong. And for that, they turned to rain. Tlaloc became the son of the Third Age, the god of rain, of moisture, of the waters that fell from the sky and soaked into the earth and made everything grow. Nahui-Ollin for rain, and at first it must have seemed like the right choice. Tlaloc was one of the most ancient and powerful deities in the Nahua pantheon. He wasn't a newcomer like some of the more culturally refined gods. He was primal. He belonged to the deep forces that shaped the land itself, the underground waters, the springs and rivers that emerged from volcanic rock, the storms that gathered over the mountains and poured their contents onto the valleys below. His domain was fertility itself, the fundamental capacity of the earth to produce life when given water. And under his sun, the world of Forain did produce life. The people of this age were nourished by the rains that Tlaloc commanded. They grew crops, they built settlements, they developed the kind of agricultural foundation that neither the giants of the first sun nor the quick-moving people of the second sun had ever achieved. For a time it looked like balance had been found. Strength through sustenance, stability through the regular cycles of rainfall that Tlaloc could provide. But Tlaloc had a dual nature, and this duality is essential to understanding why the third sun ended the way it did. He was the nurturer, the provider, the god whose waters made the corn grow and the rivers flow, and the land sustain human life. But he was also the destroyer. The same god who could send gentle rains to feed crops, could also send devastating storms, floods that washed away entire communities, hail that shattered plants and killed livestock, droughts that turned fertile valleys into dust. In Nahua thought, Tlaloc embodied a fundamental truth about water and about life itself. The force that sustains you is also the force that can drown you. The rain that fills your fields can also flood your home. The moisture that makes your food grow can also rot your stores and spread disease. There is no separation between creation and destruction here. They are the same force expressing itself in different ways, at different intensities, according to different conditions. And the third sun, the age built on rain, contained this duality from its very beginning. The end came as fire, a rain of fire. Quetzalcoatl, the very word that named this age, also named its destruction. Fire falling from the sky like rain, pouring down in torrents that incinerated everything they touched. The crops Tlaloc had nurtured burned in an instant. The settlements his rains had sustained became ash. The people who had built their lives around the regular provision of water found themselves consumed by a force they had no defense against, a force that came from above, that fell like the rain they depended on, but that destroyed instead of nourished. And then came the transformation. When the fire rain reached its peak, the people of Forain didn't simply die. They became turkeys, or in some versions, birds. Turkeys are fascinating in this context. They are creatures of the ground, tied to the earth, unable to fly far or escape quickly. They are domesticated animals, raised for sustenance, consumed as food. The people who had built their world around agricultural production, around the cycle of planting and harvesting that rain enabled, were reduced to the very form of domesticated provision. They became what they had essentially been, sources of nourishment, stripped of their cultural identity, their agency, their capacity to shape their own destiny. They kept their connection to sustenance. but lost everything that made that connection meaningful. The fire rain that destroyed the third sun isn't just mythological imagery. It resonates powerfully with real volcanic phenomena that have shaped central Mexico for millennia. Volcanic eruptions produce exactly what the myth describes. Fire falling from the sky, incandescent rock and ash raining down across vast areas. Pyroclastic flows, those terrifying surges of superheated gas and debris that can travel at hundreds of miles per hour and incinerate everything in their path. And central Mexico is one of the most volcanically active regions on the planet. The Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt runs across the entire country, a chain of stratovolcanoes that have been erupting for millions of years. Popocatépetl, Iztaccíhuatl, Nevado de Toluca, these are not dormant relics. They are active geological forces that have repeatedly reshaped the landscape, and the human communities that have tried to live on it. Archaeological evidence shows that major eruptions in this region have coincided with cultural disruptions, population displacements, the sudden abandonment of settlements that had been thriving for generations. When a volcano erupts, the experience is exactly what the Aztecs described. The sky darkens with ash. Burning material falls like rain. The familiar landscape transforms into something alien and hostile. And the communities that depended on the fertile volcanic soil, the very fertility that Tlaloc's rains enhanced, find themselves facing destruction from the same geological forces that made their land productive in the first place. The pattern repeats itself. The force that creates also destroys. The rain that nourishes also burns. The volcano that enriches the soil also incinerates the village. This connection between volcanic activity and the myth of the third sun is a theory, not a certainty. We can't prove that a specific eruption inspired the story of fire rain, but the resonance is hard to ignore. The people of central Mexico lived in a landscape defined by volcanic mountains. They experienced eruptions. They saw fire fall from the sky. They watched fertile valleys become ash fields, and they incorporated that experience into their cosmic narrative, creating a myth that expressed the fundamental duality they observed in their own environment: creation and destruction, nourishment and annihilation, rain and fire, all flowing from the same source, all expressions of the same force, all contained within the domain of the god who ruled the third sun. So the gods tried again. 3 worlds had fallen. 3 experiments in creation had ended in catastrophe. The giants consumed by jaguars, the swift people swept away by hurricane winds, the agricultural societies incinerated by fire from the sky. Each age had revealed a fundamental flaw in its design, a vulnerability that its ruling deity could not overcome. And now, for the 4th time, the gods prepared to build a world. This time they turned to water itself. Chalchutlicue became the sun of the 4th age, Nahui-Ollin Forewater. She was the goddess of lakes and rivers, of the waters that flow across the surface of the earth, of the gentle streams that nourish valleys and the vast lakes that sustain entire ecosystems. Where Tlaloc had ruled the rain that fell from above, Chalchutlicue ruled the water that pooled and gathered below. She was the Lady of the Jade Skirt, a name that speaks to how the Nahua saw her domain. Not as something turbulent or destructive, but as something precious, beautiful, life-giving. Jade was the most valued material in Mesoamerican culture. It represented water, vegetation, fertility, the fundamental forces that made human existence possible. By wearing a skirt of jade, Chalchutlicue declared her connection to everything the Nahua people depended on for survival, and under her sun, the 4th age did seem to flourish. The people of Nahui-Ollin built their lives around water. They constructed settlements near lakes and rivers. They developed fishing technologies, irrigation systems, agricultural methods that relied on reliable access to surface water They were, in a sense, the most complete civilization the gods had yet created. Not just strong like the giants, not just swift like the wind people, not just agriculturally productive like the inhabitants of Four Rain. They were all of these things and more, because water provided the foundation for everything. Transportation, food preservation, construction materials, ritual purification, the medium through which trade and communication flowed. Water wasn't just a resource for these people. It was their entire way of life. But Teotihuacan, like every deity who had ruled a previous age, contained the seed of her world's destruction within her own nature. And her nature was water. Water which gives life. Water which takes it away. This is the paradox that the Nahua understood better than perhaps any other civilization. They lived in a basin surrounded by mountains, a place where water was both the source of their existence and the constant threat to their survival. The lakes that fed their crops could also flood their fields. The rivers that carried their trade goods could also sweep away their homes. The same substance that they drank, bathed in, used for every essential function of daily life, could also rise up without warning and drown everything they had built. And that is exactly what happened. The destruction of the fourth sun came as flood. Not the gradual flooding of a river overflowing its banks, not the seasonal inundation that farmers could prepare for and adapt to. A cataclysm, waters rising beyond any possible limit, covering the mountains themselves, submerging the entire world under an ocean that had no shore and no bottom. Nahui, artful for water, fulfilled its name in the most terrible way possible. The age of water ended by water. The domain that had sustained humanity became the force that annihilated it. And the people who had built their entire civilization around lakes and rivers found themselves swallowed by the very substance they had worshipped and depended upon. But here is where the myth takes a turn that feels strange and haunting and somehow beautiful. The people of the fourth sun didn't simply drown, they were transformed. They became fish. This is a profoundly different kind of destruction than what happened in previous ages. The giants were eaten. The wind people were blown away. The agricultural societies became turkeys, ground-bound sources of meat. But the people of Forewater became creatures that could survive in the medium that was killing them. Fish don't drown. Fish swim. Fish breathe water. By becoming fish, the people of the Fourth Age didn't escape destruction exactly, but they found a way to exist within it. They adapted to the catastrophe, became native to the flood, continued living in the very world that had ended their civilization. This transformation carries a symbolic weight that goes beyond simple mythological narrative. It speaks to something the Nahua observed in their own relationship with water. Communities that faced devastating floods didn't always disappear entirely. Sometimes they adapted. They rebuilt on higher ground. They developed new construction techniques. They created drainage systems and flood management infrastructure. They became, in a sense, more like fish, more adapted to living in a watery environment, more capable of surviving the very force that had nearly destroyed them. The myth encodes this pattern of adaptation within destruction, of survival within catastrophe. The flood that ended the fourth sun also connects to something much larger than Nahua mythology alone. Flood myths are nearly universal across human cultures. From Mesopotamia's Gilgamesh epic to the biblical story of Noah, from Chinese legends of Yu the Great controlling the waters to Australian Aboriginal narratives of the Great Inundation, from Hindu accounts of Manu building a boat to survive the deluge to Polynesian stories of the sea covering the land. Almost every civilization that has left us written or oral traditions includes some version of a world-destroying flood. This universality doesn't necessarily mean that a single global flood actually happened. But it does suggest that flood experiences, devastating inundations that reshape landscapes and end civilizations, have occurred often enough across human history that the memory of them has become embedded in our collective storytelling. River valley civilizations, which produced many of the earliest written records, were particularly vulnerable to catastrophic flooding. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, the Ganges. These rivers created the fertile lands that made agriculture possible, but they also periodically delivered destruction on a scale that must have seemed like the end of the world to the people who experienced it. The Nahua flood myth fits into this global pattern, not as a copy of other traditions, but as an independent expression of the same fundamental human experience. Living beside water means living beside the possibility of annihilation. And there's something else embedded in this myth, something that the Nahua understood with a clarity that feels almost painful. Water is the most paradoxical substance in human experience. We need it constantly. Every cell in our bodies requires it. Every crop we grow depends on it. Every civilization we build incorporates it into their fundamental infrastructure. And yet, water is also the most destructive force on the planet. Floods kill more people than any other natural disaster. Droughts cause more prolonged suffering than any other environmental crisis. The same substance that we cannot live without for more than a few days can also rise up and take everything from us in a matter of hours. Tezcatlipoca embodied this paradox completely. She was the jade-skirted lady who gave life and the drowning force who took it away. She was the nurturing goddess of household water and the terrifying power of the flood that could not be contained. She was creation and destruction in the same divine form, just as Tlaloc had been before her, just as every ruler of every age had been. The gods could not escape the duality built into their own nature, and neither could the worlds they created. 4 suns had now risen and fallen. 4 ages had begun in hope and ended in devastation. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every world contained within itself the seed of its own destruction. Every divine ruler brought both life and death to their creation. Every civilization, no matter how sophisticated or well adapted, eventually faced a catastrophe that exceeded its capacity to survive. The Nahua myth-makers were telling themselves a story about the fundamental vulnerability of human existence, not as a counsel of despair, but as a recognition of reality. World's end, that is simply what happens, and after the end of each world, there is darkness, a period without a sun, without order, without the basic structures that make life possible. After the floodwaters of the 4th sun finally receded, after the fish people had adapted to their new aquatic existence, the world entered such a period. The age of darkness before the dawn of the 5th sun. An interregnum between worlds that would prove just as significant as any of the ages that had come before. Because what happened in that darkness would determine everything about the world we still inhabit today. The floodwaters receded, but they left behind something worse than devastation. They left behind nothing. No light, no warmth, no order. Just an endless, suffocating darkness that covered the entire world like a shroud wrapped tight around a corpse. Imagine it. No sunrise, no sunset, no moon or stars piercing the black. The sky itself had become a void, an absence so complete that direction lost all meaning. North and south, east and west, these concepts dissolved in a world without a sun to mark them. Time itself became uncertain. How do you measure days when there are no days? How do you count seasons when the sky never changes? The people who somehow survived the cataclysm, if there were any left, existed in a state of perpetual twilight, not even twilight, just darkness. Pure, absolute, unyielding darkness. This was the interregnum. The gap between worlds. And it was terrifying, not just for whatever remnants of humanity might have clung to existence, but for the gods themselves. Because here is something the myths make clear that we often overlook. The gods were afraid. 4 times they had built a world. 4 times they had watched it fall. And now they stood in the wreckage of their 4th failure, surrounded by darkness, facing a question that must have felt impossible. Should they try again? Could they try again? What if the next world ended just like all the others? What if the pattern was not a series of accidents, but a fundamental law of existence, that creation always carries destruction within itself, that nothing they built could ever last? The myths don't describe the gods debating in comfortable chambers or issuing decrees from thrones of gold. They describe something far more urgent and precarious. A gathering, a council. The gods came together at Teotihuacan, a name that would later mean the city where gods are made. But at this moment it was not a city at all. It was a meeting place, a sacred ground where the divine could assemble in the darkness and confront the question that hung over everything like a blade. Who would become the new sun? Not who would rule the new world. Not who would govern it or oversee its operations. Who would become the sun itself, the source of light and warmth and time, the foundation upon which everything else could be built. Because here is what 4 failed worlds had taught the gods. A world cannot exist without a sun, but a sun is not just a convenience or a decoration. It is the most fundamental act of creation, the first thing that must exist before anything else can follow. And creating a sun, the myths say, requires something that the gods had not fully confronted in previous ages. Sacrifice, real sacrifice, not the giving of gifts or the sharing of power. The transformation of one being into something fundamentally different. The surrender of self so that others may exist. The gods gathered at Teotihuacan understood this, perhaps for the first time, with complete clarity. The next sun would not simply be appointed or chosen. It would have to be made, and making it would cost something beyond measure. This period of darkness, this terrifying liminal space between the 4th sun and the 5th, carries a symbolic weight that resonates far beyond Nahua mythology. Darkness in mythological traditions worldwide is rarely just absence. It is potential. It is the void from which creation emerges. It is the state of dissolution that precedes reformation. The Nahua understood this with a sophistication that feels almost modern. Their darkness was not empty. It was charged with fear and uncertainty. Yes, but also with possibility. The gods could have chosen to accept the darkness, to let the world remain broken, to stop trying. Instead, they gathered. They faced the question together. They began the process that would lead to the most significant sacrifice in their entire mythological tradition. The tension in this moment is extraordinary. 4 worlds have fallen. The gods are standing in literal darkness, uncertain whether creation itself is possible anymore, and they are about to make a decision that will determine the fate of everything that comes after. Not just the 5th sun, not just the age we currently inhabit, the entire structure of reality going forward. Because whatever they decide in this darkness, whatever sacrifice they make, whatever sun they create, will carry within it the same paradox that destroyed every previous world. Creation and destruction, inseparable. Light, and the possibility of its extinction bound together forever. The council at Teotihuacan was about to begin, and what happened there would change everything. The gods had gathered, the darkness pressed in from every direction, absolute and unyielding. And now they faced the question that had driven them to Teotihuacan in the first place. Who would become the sun? Who would step into the void and become the source of light, warmth, and time itself? The council debated, voices rising and falling in the blackness, and eventually 2 names emerged. 2 volunteers, 2 gods willing to undergo whatever transformation was required to ignite a new age. The first was Tezcatlipoca. His name carries meanings that echo through the mythology, sometimes rendered as Lord of the Snails, sometimes connected to lunar symbolism. But his role in this story is consistent across sources. He was wealthy, powerful, proud. Tezcatlipoca was what the Nahua would have called a Teotihuacan, a lord, a person of high status and commanding presence. When the council asked for volunteers, he stepped forward immediately. Of course he would become the sun. Who else could possibly be worthy? He was born for this. His wealth, his bearing, his very nature seemed to demand that he occupy the highest position in the new cosmos. The source of all light, the centre of all things. The second volunteer was Nanahuatzin, and everything about him stood in stark contrast to Tezcatlipoca. His name is often translated as the Pustulant Lord or the one covered in boils. He was sick, poor, humble, not a lord but a figure associated with disease and suffering, a god who existed at the margins of divine society, barely noticed, easily overlooked. When the council asked for volunteers, Nanahuatzin also stepped forward, but not with Tezcatlipoca's confidence. He stepped forward because no one else would, because the role needed to be filled and he was willing to fill it. There was no arrogance in his offer, no assumption of worthiness, just a quiet, desperate willingness to do what was necessary. The myth could not have constructed a more deliberate moral contrast. Pride versus humility, wealth versus poverty. The lord who assumes he deserves the highest honour versus the outcast who accepts the lowest burden. This pairing was not accidental. The Nahua were telling a story about what truly makes someone worthy of cosmic significance, and the answer they gave contradicted every assumption that status and power naturally confer. The gods did not immediately choose between the 2 volunteers. Instead, they established a period of preparation, 4 days of ritual fasting and penance, 4 days during which both candidates would purify themselves, make offerings, and demonstrate their readiness for the transformation ahead. The number 4 was not arbitrary. It echoed the 4 previous worlds, the 4 directions, the 4 cardinal forces that structured Nahua cosmology. Everything significant happened in 4s, but the offerings each god prepared revealed the same contrast that their characters had already established. Tezcatlipoca, the wealthy lord, brought precious things: Quetzal feathers, gold ornaments, jade beads, spines from the magi plant, but these were luxury items, rare and beautiful objects that reflected his status and his belief that the sun should be adorned with the finest materials the world could offer. His incense was the most fragrant available, the kind reserved for elite rituals. Everything about his preparation proclaimed his worthiness through abundance. Nanahuatzin brought something entirely different. His offerings were not precious. They were humble, reed spines, the kind anyone could gather from the banks of a canal. His incense was not the fragrant kind reserved for lords. It was the ordinary kind, the kind that burned in everyday ceremonies, the kind that common people used when they prayed for health or harvest. He offered his own blood, drawn through auto-sacrifice, piercing his flesh with those simple reed spines and letting the drops fall as his gift to the sacred fire. No gold, no jade, no rare feathers, just the willingness to suffer and the sincere offering of what he actually had. The moral architecture of this myth is unmistakable. The Nahua were not simply telling a story about how the sun was created. They were encoding a value system into the very foundation of their cosmology. The 5th sun, the sun we live under today, was not born from wealth or pride or assumed superiority. It was born from humility, from suffering willingly accepted, from the offering of what one actually possesses rather than what one merely displays. This is a profound statement about what the Nahua believed made creation possible, not power asserting itself, but vulnerability offering itself. And this story was not abstract mythology, disconnected from the real world. It was rooted in a place, Teotihuacan. The name itself, the city where gods are made, tells us that the people who told this myth understood it as connected to a specific sacred location. Teotihuacan was already ancient when the Aztecs encountered it. Its massive pyramids, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, its broad avenue lined with temples and palaces, had been built centuries before the Aztec Empire existed, by a civilization whose name and language have been lost to time. But the site never lost its sacred power. For generations, perhaps centuries, Teotihuacan served as a pilgrimage destination. People came from across Mesoamerica to walk its avenues, to climb its pyramids, to perform rituals at the place where, they believed, the gods themselves had once gathered in the darkness and made the sun. The myth and the place reinforced each other. The story gave Teotihuacan its cosmic significance. Teotihuacan gave the story a physical anchor, a real location where people could stand and feel perhaps some echo of that primordial council. The 4 days of fasting and penance were ending. The offerings had been made. The contrast between the two volunteers had been established with absolute clarity. And now the moment of transformation was approaching. The sacred fire waited at Teotihuacan. The fire that would consume one of these gods and remake them into something the world had never seen. A sun, a source of light in the darkness, the foundation of the fifth age. But which god would step into that fire? The proud lord with his precious offerings, or the humble sufferer with his reed spines and common incense? The answer would determine not just who became the sun, but what kind of sun the fifth age would have. What principles would govern it? What values would shine down upon the world? Everything hung on this moment, and the gods gathered at Teotihuacan watched in silence as the two volunteers prepared to face the fire. The bonfire roared at Teotihuacan. 4 days of fasting and penance had ended. The offerings had been given, precious jade and fragrant incense from one, humble reeds and common smoke from the other. And now the moment that everything had been building toward arrived. The sacred fire blazed on the pyramid platform, its heat rolling out in waves across the gathered gods, its light the only illumination in that primordial darkness. This fire was not merely a physical flame, it was the threshold between existence and transformation, the boundary where a god would cease to be what they were and become something entirely new. The source of light, the foundation of time, the anchor of the fifth age, Tezcatlipoca. The wealthy lord, the one who had assumed this honour was his by right, stepped forward first. The gods watched, the fire waited, and Tezcatlipoca approached the edge of the blazing pyre. He drew close enough to feel the searing heat on his skin, close enough that the flames should have embraced him, should have consumed him and begun the transformation that he had spent 4 days preparing for. But at the moment of commitment, at the instant when self-sacrifice would become reality, something happened. Tezcatlipoca faltered. He stepped back. The fire still roared. The darkness still pressed, but the proud lord could not bring himself to leap. He tried again. He approached the bonfire a second time, drawing near the blistering heat, preparing to throw himself into the transformation that would remake him into the sun. And again he stepped back, a third time, a fourth time. 4 approaches, 4 retreats. The number echoed the structure of Nahua cosmology, but here it carried a different resonance. It marked not completion, but failure, not sacred transformation, but human hesitation. Tezcatlipoca, despite all his wealth, despite all his precious offerings, despite his absolute certainty that he deserved to become the sun, could not do what the moment required. He could not sacrifice himself. The very pride that had made him volunteer now became the barrier that prevented him from acting. He had assumed the honour would be given to him. He had not understood that it had to be earned through an act so total, so absolute, that it required the annihilation of everything he was. And then Nanahuatzin moved. The humble god, the sick one, the one covered in boils who had brought nothing precious, nothing rare, nothing that proclaimed his worthiness. Nanahuatzin did not hesitate. He did not approach the fire 4 times and retreat 4 times. He walked forward with steady, quiet determination, and he leaped. One single motion, no deliberation, no testing of the heat, no calculation of whether the transformation was worth the cost. Nanahuatzin threw himself into the sacred fire with the same willingness that had made him volunteer in the first place. The willingness to do what was necessary because it was necessary, not because he deserved the reward. The flames consumed him. The bonfire blazed brighter, searing white, then brilliant gold, then colours that the gathered gods had never seen, colours that seemed to exist beyond the spectrum of the darkness that had covered the world for so long. Nanahuatzin burned, and in burning he was transformed. The god who had existed at the margins, the one barely noticed, easily overlooked, the one associated with disease and suffering, was gone. In his place, something unimaginable was taking shape. Light, warmth, radiance pouring outward from the pyre at Teotihuacan, flooding across the darkness, reaching toward every horizon, filling the void that had pressed in from every direction since the end of the 4th sun. Nanahuatzin had become the sun. Tezcatlipoca, watching this transformation, seeing the humble god achieve what he had failed to achieve, felt something shift within himself. Shame, perhaps. Resolve, perhaps. Or simply the recognition that if he did not act now, he would be left behind in the darkness forever. He threw himself into the fire, but the transformation that followed was different. Where Nanahuatzin had become brilliant, searing, overwhelming light, Tezcatlipoca became something lesser. A second luminary, a pale reflection. He emerged from the flames as the moon, glowing but dim, present but secondary, forever accompanying the sun, but never matching its power. The gods looked up at the 2 new bodies in the sky, and they saw a problem. 2 lights, 2 sources of illumination, but they were too similar. Tezcatlipoca's lunar glow was still bright enough to rival the sun, bright enough that the 2 luminaries shone with nearly equal intensity. This could not be allowed. The cosmos required hierarchy. It required a clear distinction between the source of all light and its lesser companion. One of the gods acted quickly. The stories vary on which god performed this act, but the action itself is consistent across sources. A rabbit was thrown at Tezcatlipoca's face. The rabbit struck the moon and dimmed its light forever, leaving the mark that we can still see today when we look up at the lunar surface. The dark patches on the moon, the shapes that later cultures would interpret as faces or figures, the Nahua saw as the rabbit permanently imprinted on Tezcatlipoca's diminished radiance. The moon was subdued, the sun ruled alone. The myth of Nanahuatzin's leap carries a message that resonated through every layer of Nahua society. Self-sacrifice is the engine of cosmic renewal. The world does not continue because powerful beings assert their dominance. It continues because someone is willing to give themselves entirely, to burn away everything they are so that something new can exist. This was not abstract philosophy. It was the theological foundation of a culture that practiced ritual sacrifice on a scale that still shocks and disturbs modern sensibilities. The Aztecs understood human sacrifice as a continuation of Nanahuatzin's original act. The sun needed nourishment to keep moving across the sky. It needed blood, the sacred fluid that carried life force, to sustain the radiance that Nanahuatzin had created through his own destruction. Every sacrificial victim, every warrior captured in battle, every priest who drew his own blood through auto-sacrifice was participating in the same fundamental process that had brought the fifth sun into existence. The willingness to offer life so that life could continue. Whether this theology justified the practice or merely explained it, whether the myth emerged from existing sacrificial traditions, or whether the tradition developed to honour the myth, scholars continue to debate. But the connection between Nanahuatzin's leap and Aztec ritual practice is undeniable. The story and the reality reinforced each other in a feedback loop of belief and action that sustained an empire. And yet, for all its cultural specificity, the myth speaks to something universal. The recognition that creation requires sacrifice, that the new cannot emerge without the destruction of the old, that the light we depend on was born from someone's willingness to step into the fire. Nanahuatzin, the least of the gods, became the greatest luminary in the sky. Not through power, not through wealth, not through assumed superiority, but through the simple, devastating act of offering everything he was. The sun had been born, Nanahuatzin had leaped into the flames, had burned away his suffering and his humility, had emerged as the great luminary that would define the fifth age. The moon had been subdued, its light, dimmed by the rabbit, struck across Tezcatlipoc's face. The gods had witnessed the transformation. The darkness had been shattered. Everything should have been set into motion. The fifth sun should have begun its journey across the sky, marking time, creating day and night, establishing the rhythm that all living things would follow. But something was wrong. The sun did not move. Imagine this. You have just witnessed the most profound act of self-sacrifice imaginable. A god has destroyed himself to become the source of all light. The darkness that has pressed in from every direction since the end of the fourth age has finally been broken. And now you look up at this brilliant new luminary, this searing point of radiance in the sky, and you wait for it to begin its journey. You wait for it to rise in the east, traverse the heavens, and set in the west, establishing the first day of the new world. But the sun stays where it is, motionless, fixed in the zenith. The light pours down endlessly, burning relentless, but the sun itself refuses to travel its appointed path. The fifth age has its light, but it has no movement, no time, no rhythm. The world hangs suspended in an eternal noon. The gods gathered below that stationary sun realized what was happening, or rather, they realized what was required. Nanahuatzin's sacrifice had created the sun, but it had not given it the force to move. The sun needed something more. It needed vitality. It needed energy. It needed the life force of the divine beings who had witnessed its creation. And so the gods made their final choice. The same choice Nanahuatzin had made. The same choice that all creation demands in the Nahua worldview. They offered themselves, one by one. The gods approached the stationary sun. The sources vary on exactly which deities participated and in what order, but the core action remains consistent across every telling. Teotihuacan, the wind god, the aspect of Quetzalcoatl associated with breath and motion, was among them. So was Xochipilli, the prince of flowers associated with beauty and artistic creation. So was Maquilxochitl, the five-flower, god of games and dance. So were others whose names and functions have been lost to time, or preserved only in fragmented manuscripts. They came forward, and they gave themselves to the sun. Not by leaping into a fire this time, but through a different kind of transformation. They offered their blood, their vital force, their Ika, the sacred essence that animated their divine bodies, and in offering it they died. The sun absorbed their sacrifice. Their life force became the fuel that powered its movement. The stationary luminary began to stir. It began to tremble. It began to inch forward, haltingly at first, then with increasing confidence, then with the steady, irreversible momentum that would carry it across the heavens for the duration of the Fifth Age. But it was not enough. The sun had received the sacrifice of the gods, had consumed their vitality, had transformed their death into its motion. But it still needed one final push, one additional force to set it fully on its path, to establish the cycle that would govern all life under the fifth sun. And that force was wind. Teotihuacan, who had already offered his divine life force, now performed his final and most crucial act. Even in death, even after sacrificing himself alongside the other gods, Teotihuacan exerted his power one last time. The wind god blew. A great breath surged across the heavens, a cosmic exhalation that caught the stirring sun and pushed it forward with irresistible force. The sun began to move properly, truly, completely. It rose in the east, arced across the sky, and set in the west. The first day of the Fifth Age dawned and ended. Time had begun. The rhythm of existence had been established. The world could finally function as a world. But consider the implications of what had just happened. The sun did not move on its own. It required sacrifice to begin its journey. It required the death of gods to fuel its motion. It required the breath of the wind god to push it into its proper path. What does this mean for the ongoing functioning of the cosmos? It means that the fifth sun, the age we are currently living in, the age of Nahui-Ollin, the age of movement, is sustained by sacrifice. The sun moves because it was fed with divine blood. It continues to move because it continues to be fed. The original sacrifice of the gods established the pattern, but that pattern must be maintained. The fuel must be replenished. The life force must be offered again and again and again, or the sun will stop, just as it stopped on that first day. This is the theological foundation that the Aztecs built upon. The gods had died so that the world could exist. The gods had given their blood so that the sun could move. And now human beings, the inhabitants of the Fifth Age, the beneficiaries of all this divine self-sacrifice, had a cosmic obligation. They had to continue feeding the sun. They had to provide the vital force that kept it on its path. This was not optional. This was not a suggestion. This was the fundamental requirement of existence under the fifth sun. Without sacrifice, the sun would halt. Without blood, the light would fail. Without the continuous offering of life force, the world would end, just as the 4 previous worlds had ended. And this time, there would be no new creation, no sixth age, no rebirth. The fifth sun was the last one. If it fell, everything fell. Whether this myth developed before or after the Aztecs began their documental practice of human sacrifice, whether the theology emerged from the ritual or the ritual emerged from the theology, remains a matter of scholarly debate. But the connection is unmistakable. The Aztecs understood themselves as the stewards of cosmic continuity. Their sacrifices, whether the bloodletting of priests in midnight temples, or the elaborate public ceremonies on the steps of the great temple in Tenochtitlan, were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of responsibility. They were the fulfillment of a debt owed to the gods who had died so that the world could live. Every drop of blood offered on every stone altar was a continuation of that original sacrifice at Teotihuacan. The gods had given themselves so that the sun could exist. Humanity had to give itself so that the sun could continue. This was the Aztec sense of cosmic duty, not mere obedience to divine authority, but active participation in the maintenance of the cosmos. The world was not a gift freely given. It was a loan sustained by sacrifice, requiring constant repayment. And the Aztecs, more than any other Mesoamerican culture, had taken upon themselves the burden of making those payments. They had assumed the responsibility of feeding the sun of keeping it moving, of preventing the cataclysm that would come if the sacrifices stopped. This was their theology. This was their identity. This was the weight they carried as the people of the fifth sun. And so we arrive at our own age, the age we are living in right now, whether we know it or not. The Aztecs called it Nahui-Ollin, four movement, the fifth sun. The sun deity who presides over this era carries a specific name, Tonatiuh, but the name tells you less than the title. Tonatiuh is not just the sun. Tonatiuh is the sun that moves, the sun that requires fuel, the sun that was born from sacrifice and continues only through sacrifice. Every dawn is a reminder of what Nanahuatzin gave. Every sunset is a reminder of what could be lost if the offerings cease. But why movement? Why is our age defined not by water, not by wind, not by fire, not by jaguars, but by motion? The Nahua understanding of Ollin goes far beyond simple physical movement. Ollin is the pulse of existence. It is the shifting of tectonic plates beneath the earth. It is the trembling of muscles before a leap. It is the oscillation of day into night, into day. It is the rhythm of life and death cycling endlessly through all living things. Movement in this worldview is not neutral. Movement is unstable. Movement is change, and change by its very nature implies impermanence. Nothing that moves can remain fixed. Nothing that shifts can hold its shape forever. The very quality that defines our age, the quality of constant, restless motion, also guarantees that this age cannot last. This is the profound paradox of Nahui-Ollin. The fifth sun moves because the gods died to make it move. But because it moves, it will eventually stop. The prophecy is explicit and unambiguous. The fifth age will end in earthquakes, not floods, not fire from the sky, not hurricanes that strip the flesh from bones. Earthquakes. The earth itself will shift, will heave, will shatter the foundations of everything built upon it. Mountains will crumble, temples will fall. The ground that seemed solid, that seemed permanent, that seemed like the one thing you could trust in a world defined by motion, will betray you. It will move too much. It will move beyond any capacity to withstand, and the age of movement will end in the most violent movement imaginable. Think about what this means psychologically, existentially, for a culture that lives under this understanding. You are not living in a stable world. You are not standing on solid ground. You are perching on a surface that is constantly shifting, constantly trembling, constantly threatening to tear itself apart. Your entire civilization, your temples, your markets, your homes, your fields of maize, your networks of trade and kinship, all of it is balanced on movement. All of it exists only because the sun continues its path across the sky. And the sun continues its path only because blood continues to flow from sacrificial altars. Remove the blood, and the sun halts. Halt the sun, and the earth quakes. Quake the earth, and everything falls. The Aztecs understood their era as fragile, temporary, a moment of light between great darknesses, sustained by an obligation that could never be relaxed. This is not a mythology of comfort. It does not promise that things will get better. It does not promise that the good guys win in the end. It promises only that the current arrangement, this particular configuration of sun and earth and human life, will continue for as long as the terms of its existence are met. And when those terms are violated, when the sacrifices stop, when the debt goes unpaid, the arrangement collapses. Not gradually, not slowly, in a single catastrophic upheaval that shatters everything. And there is something else embedded in this understanding, something that would be carved into the most famous monument of the Aztec world. The concept of Nahui-Ollin, four-movement, the date that defines our age, is written into the very centre of the Aztec Sun Stone. That massive basalt disc, 12 feet in diameter, carved with intricate symbols surrounding a central face. That face is Tonatiuh, the son of the fifth age. His tongue extends outward, a blade ready to receive blood. His eyes stare forward, demanding, unblinking. And surrounding his face, in the circle that frames him, is the glyph Ollin, movement. The movement that defines our era. The movement that will eventually destroy it. The Sunstone is not just a calendar. It is a warning. It is a reminder. It is a myth carved in basalt, set into the architecture of empire, proclaiming to everyone who sees it, you live in the age of movement. You live on unstable ground. Your world will shake itself to pieces unless you feed the god who holds it together. And that warning was not meant to be subtle. The Aztec Sun Stone, the Piedra del Sol, makes this mythology physical, undeniable, carved into 12 feet of solid basalt weighing over 20 tons. Imagine the effort it took, mining the stone, transporting it across miles of terrain, carving every glyph, every symbol, every intricate detail, using only stone tools and abrasive sand. This was not a casual undertaking. This was an empire committing its deepest beliefs, its most fundamental understanding of reality, into a single massive object that could not be ignored or forgotten. The stone was buried at some point, probably after the Spanish conquest, when the new authorities sought to erase the old religion from the physical landscape of Mexico City. It lay hidden under the dirt and rubble of a transforming city for over 200 years. Then, in 1790, workers excavating beneath the central plaza of Mexico City, the Zócalo, struck something massive and unyielding. They pulled it from the earth and found themselves staring into the face of Tonatiuh. That face emerging from centuries of darkness must have been overwhelming. Those same unblinking eyes, that extended tongue still demanding. The entire Five Suns narrative preserved in stone, suddenly visible again to a world that had tried to bury it. But how do you actually read this thing? How do you decode a myth carved in basalt? You start at the centre. That face we discussed. Tonatiuh grips the innermost circle of the disc. His mouth frames the glyph for Ollin, movement, the defining quality of our age. And within that Ollin glyph, embedded in the 4 petals of the movement symbol, are the names of the 4 previous suns. 4 jaguar on the upper right, 4 wind on the upper left, 4 rain on the lower left, 4 water on the lower right. They are literally surrounding the face of the current sun, contained within his movement. The past ages are not gone. They are absorbed into the present. They are part of the oscillation that keeps the 5th sun alive, and that will eventually tear it apart. The destruction of each previous world, the jaguars that devoured the giants, the hurricanes that shattered the wind people, the fire rain that roasted the bird folk, the flood that drowned everything. All of these endings are encoded in the space that defines our current beginning. Surrounding this central composition is a ring of 20-day signs, the fundamental calendar glyphs that structured Nahua timekeeping. Beyond that, 4 larger rectangles mark the previous 4 suns in even more explicit detail, showing the specific fates of each age with clear visual symbols. Jaguars in the first quadrant, wind in the second, rain of fire in the third, water in the fourth. The entire narrative of cosmic creation and destruction is laid out like a schematic diagram, a cosmological chart in stone. But here is where scholars diverge. What was this object actually for? The obvious interpretation is that it was a calendar. The name Sun Stone itself implies timekeeping, and the presence of those 20-day glyphs, combined with numerical markers, certainly connects it to the complex Aztec calendrical systems. But a calendar alone does not need a demanding god at its centre. A calendar does not need to enumerate the catastrophic ends of 4 previous worlds. A calendar tracks days. This object tracks something far more urgent, Some researchers argue it was an altar, a surface for sacrificial offerings, possibly for gladiatorial combat where captives fought on the disc itself, their blood feeding the face that demanded it. The stone was originally positioned horizontally, not vertically as it is displayed today, which would support this interpretation. You do not carve an altar standing upright. You carve it flat, functional, ready to receive what is offered. Others see it as something more abstract, a cosmological chart. A visual encyclopedia of Nahua cosmology, encoding the entire structure of the universe. The 5 ages, the directionality of cosmic forces, the relationship between time and destruction, all compressed into a single teachable image. Perhaps it was all of these things simultaneously. The Aztecs did not separate time from religion, religion from sacrifice, sacrifice from cosmology. The calendar was the cosmos. The altar was the calendar. The chart was the altar. Each function flowed into the others seamlessly, because the underlying understanding was the same. Time moves because gods died. Gods died because time demanded it. The stone simply makes this reciprocal relationship visible. Today, the sunstone sits in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. It has become the most recognized symbol of Mexican national identity, reproduced on coins, on logos, on tourist merchandise everywhere. A culture that tried to erase it ended up embracing it as its defining icon. But that embrace often strips away the warning. The stone becomes decorative, historical, proud, and it is all of those things, but it is also something more unsettling. It is a record of 5 ages, 4 of which ended in catastrophe. It is a face with a tongue extended like a blade demanding payment. It is a glyph for movement inscribed at the heart of an empire that believed the ground beneath it was never still, never safe, never permanent. But myths do not spring from nowhere. They grow in soil watered by real events, real catastrophes, real endings that people witnessed and survived and then struggled to explain. And if you want to understand where the Aztec vision of dying suns and destroyed worlds might truly originate, you have to look at the most spectacular ruin in all of Mesoamerica. You have to look at Teotihuacan. Picture a city that should not have existed. In a valley with no reliable river, in a landscape that demanded enormous effort just to sustain basic agriculture, human hands built something unprecedented. Starting around 100 BCE, thousands of people began gathering in the Teotihuacan Valley northeast of what would later become Mexico City. They came for reasons we still do not fully understand. Perhaps religious significance drew them first. Perhaps trade routes converged here. Perhaps political pressures pushed displaced populations into this specific location. Whatever the initial cause, what happened next was remarkable. Over the next 3 centuries, Teotihuacan grew into the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, and possibly the largest in the world at that time. At its height around 400 CE, Teotihuacan housed somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. Think about those numbers for a moment. This was not a village. This was not even a typical ancient city. This was a metropolis, an urban centre whose population density and monumental architecture rivaled anything contemporary Rome or Constantinople could offer. The Pyramid of the Sun alone contains more than 1 million cubic meters of fill material, making it one of the largest structures ever built in the ancient Americas. The Avenue of the Dead stretches for over 1 mile, flanked by temples, palaces, and residential compounds of astonishing complexity. Apartment complexes housed hundreds of people in multi-story structures with drainage systems and interior courtyards. Murals covered walls in vibrant colours depicting jaguars, eagles, feathered serpents, and elaborate ritual scenes. Trade networks connected Teotihuacan to regions as distant as the Maya lowlands to the east and Monte Alban to the south. Obsidian from local sources became the economic backbone of the city, worked into tools, weapons, and decorative objects that circulated across thousands of miles. This was not just a city, it was a system, an entire civilization concentrated in one extraordinary place. And then it ended. Sometime around the middle of the 6th century, probably between 550 and 600 CE, Teotihuacan began to collapse. Not gradually over centuries, but quickly, violently, decisively. The archaeological evidence tells a brutal story. Along the Avenue of the Dead and in the city's central administrative and ritual complexes, excavators have found extensive burn marks. Not small fires that damaged individual structures, but massive conflagrations that consumed entire building complexes simultaneously. The Palace of Quetzalcoatl, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, multiple elite residences, all show the same pattern: intentional, systematic destruction. The fires were not accidental. They were not natural disasters spreading unpredictably through wooden structures. Someone burned these buildings deliberately, and they burned the most important ones first. But fire alone does not explain what happened. The residential compounds on the city's outskirts show a different pattern. No massive burning there, but instead gradual abandonment. Occupants left their homes, took their most valuable possessions and departed, leaving everyday items scattered on floors as if people walked out one day and simply never returned. Population declined steadily over decades, not overnight. The elite centre was destroyed violently, while the common periphery emptied slowly, suggesting two interconnected crises: a social upheaval targeting the ruling class, and a broader environmental disaster, making the city increasingly uninhabitable for everyone. That environmental dimension has become clearer in recent years. Paleoclimate data from lake sediments and ice cores indicates that the 6th century experienced significant drought conditions across central Mexico. Rainfall patterns shifted, agricultural yields dropped. The same marginal environment that had always made Teotihuacan vulnerable became actively hostile. When crops fail repeatedly in a city of over 100,000 people that imports much of its food from surrounding regions, pressure builds. Dependency becomes danger, and in Teotihuacan's case that pressure appears to have snapped. The most likely reconstruction goes something like this. Extended drought strained the agricultural systems that fed the massive population. Resource scarcity created social tension between different factions within the city, possibly between the ruling elite who controlled religious and economic institutions and the common populations who actually produced the food and labour that sustained those institutions. At some breaking point, an internal uprising targeted the symbols of elite power, burning temples and palaces in a systematic act of political and spiritual rejection. Whether foreign invaders participated in this destruction remains debated. Some evidence suggests external groups may have taken advantage of internal weakness. But the primary damage appears to have been inflicted by people who knew the city intimately, who understood which buildings mattered most, who wanted to destroy not just physical structures but the entire system those structures represented. After this destruction, Teotihuacan never recovered. The population scattered. The monumental architecture stood empty. The trade networks dissolved. What had been the beating heart of Mesoamerican civilization became a ghost city, inhabited only by squatters and small remnant communities who lived among the ruins without maintaining them. Within a few generations, even those remnants faded away, leaving the pyramids and avenues to silence and wind. Now here is where the connection to Aztec mythology becomes both fascinating and dangerous. Centuries later, the people we call the Aztecs, the Mexica, arrived in the Valley of Mexico. They encountered Teotihuacan as a vast abandoned landscape of colossal structures. They had no direct knowledge of who built it or why it fell. The city's original name, its original language, its original inhabitants, all had been lost to time. What remained was stone, immense, mysterious, clearly sacred stone. The Mexica called it Teotihuacan, meaning roughly the place where gods were born, or the city of gods. They looked at those pyramids, those avenues, that abandoned grandeur, and they understood instinctively that this place had been the centre of something enormous. Something that had ended, something that had been greater than anything their own young empire had yet achieved. It is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that standing among those silent monuments shaped the Mexica understanding of cosmic cycles. Here was physical evidence that great worlds rise and fall. Here was proof written in architecture that civilizations can reach astonishing heights and then collapse utterly, leaving nothing but echoes. The imagery of suns dying, of worlds consumed by catastrophe, of ages ending in fire and flood, may have drawn some of its emotional power from the visible reality of Teotihuacan's ruined pyramids. A people who walked through a dead city every day might naturally develop a cosmology built around the expectation that their own world could die just as completely. But we must be careful here. The danger of overinterpreting is real and significant. We cannot simply read the Aztec myth of the five suns as a coded history of Teotihuacan's collapse. That reduction strips the mythology of its deeper dimensions, its philosophical complexity, its genuine cosmological content. The Five Suns narrative is not just a memory of one specific city falling. It is a comprehensive understanding of how reality itself operates, how creation and destruction are woven into the fundamental fabric of existence, how time moves through cycles that transcend any single human event. Teotihuacan's real collapse may have reinforced and validated this worldview, may have provided visible proof that endings happen, but it did not alone create it. The myth draws from far older roots, far broader experiences, far more extensive cultural memories than a single urban catastrophe, however dramatic. But Teotihuacan was not the only great civilization to rise and fall in the lands that would become the Aztec Empire's home. There was another, a later civilization whose shadow loomed even larger over the Mexica's understanding of themselves and their place in the cosmic order: the Toltecs. When the Aztecs looked back into their past, they did not speak of Teotihuacan as their direct ancestors. That city belonged to an era too remote, too alien, its builders too thoroughly erased from memory. Instead, the Mexica claimed descent from a people whose name became synonymous with greatness itself. Toltecaotl, the Toltec legacy, meant artistry, wisdom, civilization, everything noble and accomplished in human culture. To call someone a Toltec was not merely to identify their ethnic origin. It was to say they had achieved the highest standard of human excellence. The Aztecs described Toltec artisans as masters who could work jade into shapes so lifelike that the carved birds seemed ready to fly, whose featherwork dazzled the eye, whose architecture set the standard for every generation that followed. In the Aztec imagination, the Toltecs were the golden age. The civilization that proved human greatness was possible. And then they too were gone. The historical Toltecs emerged around the 10th century CE in the city of Tula, located northwest of Teotihuacan in what is now the state of Hidalgo. Tula was impressive, though far smaller than its predecessor. At its height, it probably housed between 30,000 and 40,000 people, a regional power rather than a continental metropolis. Its architecture featured distinctive columns carved in the shape of armed warriors, massive stone Atlantean figures standing atop Pyramid B, their arms once raised holding weapons now lost to time. Quetzalcoatl imagery appeared everywhere. Feathered serpent heads lined temple facades. The cult of the feathered serpent, the deity who would become so central to Aztec cosmology, found its most powerful expression under the Toltecs. But the Toltec legacy that reached the Aztecs was not purely the archaeological reality of Tula. It was filtered through a figure who blurs the boundary between history and myth until the two become inseparable. A cattle Teotihuacan Quetzalcoatl, a man who took the name of the god, or perhaps a god who once walked as a man. The sources cannot agree, and maybe that disagreement is itself the point. Teotihuacan Quetzalcoatl was said to have been a priest-king, a ruler who promoted peace, artistry, and the avoidance of human sacrifice. He governed Tula in accordance with what the Aztecs remembered as a more enlightened path, a way of relating to the divine that did not require the spilling of human blood to keep the sun moving across the sky. And then his enemies destroyed him, or drove him out, or tempted him into disgrace. The stories multiply and contradict themselves, but they all end the same way. Teotihuacan Quetzalcoatl was exiled from Tula, according to the most widely known version, rival priests loyal to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the god of sorcery and night and ruthless power, undermined the feathered serpent's rule. They used trickery, intoxication, and political manipulation to discredit the good king. Humiliated, betrayed, Teotihuacan departed eastward toward the Gulf Coast, eventually sailing away on a raft of serpents, promising to return one day in the year Seacatl to reclaim his throne and restore his vision of civilization. With his exile, Tula fell. The historical and archaeological record supports this, though it strips away the mythological drama. Sometime around the late 12th century, roughly 1175 to 1200 CE, Tula's monumental buildings were burned and abandoned. Not over centuries, but quickly, much like Teotihuacan. Excavations reveal fire damage in the ceremonial centre. Warrior columns were toppled and broken, the population dispersed. What had been a regional power simply ceased to exist within a generation or two. What caused this collapse? The evidence points to a convergence of the same forces that had destroyed Teotihuacan and would eventually threaten the Aztecs themselves. Paleoclimate studies indicate another period of significant drought in central Mexico during the late 12th century, exactly when Tula was declining. Agricultural production would have suffered. Food supplies would have contracted. Internal conflict between different factions within Toltec society, perhaps between Teotihuacan's faction, emphasizing ritual piety, and Tezcatlipoca's faction, embracing militarism and human sacrifice, may have torn the political order apart from within. External pressure from migrating northern groups, Chichimeque peoples moving south into the increasingly fertile territories that Toltec decline was opening up, added military stress to environmental and social crises. Invasion, drought, and internal betrayal all converging at once. The same pattern, the same ending. And for the Aztecs, this was not just history. This was prophecy fulfilled. This was proof of the cosmic rhythm. Look at what happened. A great civilization rises under a righteous ruler who aligns himself with Quetzalcoatl, the force of creation and wisdom. Then Tezcatlipoca, the force of destruction and transformation, intervenes through human agents. The ruler is cast out, the city burns, the people scatter. The age ends. This is exactly the pattern of the 5 suns. Each age ruled by a particular divine force. Each ended when a rival power intervenes. Each destroyed by catastrophe that is simultaneously natural and supernatural, environmental and theological. The Toltec collapse was not merely a historical event for the Aztecs. It was a local manifestation of the universal truth that worlds must die so that new worlds can be born. And this is where the Aztec self-image crystallizes. The Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico in the 13th century as outsiders, rough northern migrants with no glorious past to claim. They built their city on an island in a lake, because the more powerful established kingdoms had left them nowhere else to settle. They were nobody. They had nothing. But they looked at Teotihuacan's ruins and the Toltec memory, and they understood something profound. They were not the first great civilization in this land. They were the third, and the first two had both fallen. Both had been destroyed by forces that combined environmental catastrophe with divine intervention and human failure. Both had ended in fire, in abandonment, in the scattering of their people into the margins of history. The Aztecs did not see themselves as exempt from this pattern. They saw themselves as its inheritors, its continuation. They were the ones tasked with keeping the fifth sun alive through blood and vigilance, precisely because they understood, with the evidence of two collapsed civilizations literally surrounding them, that this sun too would die if they failed. They were not building an eternal empire. They were maintaining a fragile flame in a universe built to extinguish such flames. They were heirs continuing a broken lineage, carrying the accumulated weight of every great civilization that had fallen before them, knowing that their own greatness would be tested by the same cosmic forces that had undone their predecessors. But even the Toltecs were not the beginning. Not really. When the Aztecs looked back through their mythological history, they saw Tula, they saw Teotihuacan, and then the memory went hazy, fading into something that felt more like dream than history. But the ruins were still there, massive, incomprehensible, scattered across the landscape like the bones of something enormous that had died long before anyone could remember its name. The Olmecs. The Olmec civilization emerged around 1200 BCE in the lowlands of southern Mexico, in the steamy coastal plains of what is now Veracruz and Tabasco. They were Mesoamerica's first complex society, the people who essentially invented what we now recognize as Mesoamerican civilization. Step pyramids, ball courts, writing, long-distance trade networks. The elaborate ritual calendar that would eventually become the Aztecs' own system of counting days and destinies. All of it traces its roots back to the Olmecs. They carved colossal heads from single blocks of basalt, each one weighing tons, transported from quarries miles away over swampy terrain without draft animals or wheels. Heads so large and so lifelike that when later peoples found them, they must have stared in wonder, trying to imagine who could have made such things and why. And then sometime around 400 BCE, the major Olmec centers like Leventa were abandoned. Not gradually, over centuries of slow decline, but relatively quickly. The great pyramids fell silent. The carved monuments were deliberately damaged or buried, sometimes ritually interred, as though the Olmecs themselves were giving their creations a proper funeral before walking away. The people did not simply vanish. They dispersed, probably migrating north and west, carrying their knowledge and traditions into new territories where they influenced emerging cultures. But their heartland, the centre of their world, was emptied. What caused this abandonment? The theories multiply, much as they do for Teotihuacan and Tula. Some researchers point to environmental shifts. The rivers that had sustained La Venta and other centres may have changed course, gradually redirecting the water supply away from the settlements that depended on it. Without reliable water, agriculture becomes precarious, and complex societies dependent on surplus food production begin to fracture. Other evidence suggests volcanic activity. The Tuxtla Mountains near the Olmec heartland were volcanically active during this period. Eruptions could have deposited ash across wide areas, poisoning fields, contaminating water sources, and making continued habitation impossible. Resource depletion offers another explanation. The Olmecs had been exploiting their environment intensively for centuries, harvesting timber for construction, clearing land for agriculture, pulling stone from quarries at enormous effort. Perhaps they simply exhausted what their region could provide. Any one of these factors could have driven the Olmecs from their homeland. More likely, several converged at once. The same pattern. Now here is where things become more speculative, but also more intriguing. The Olmec collapse occurred around 400 BCE. The Aztecs established their empire in the early 15th century. That gap is roughly 1800 years. Can mythological memory really stretch across such an expanse? Can oral traditions preserve meaningful information about events that occurred nearly 2 millennia before the people telling the stories ever lived? The honest answer is that tracing direct myth-to-history links this far back is extraordinarily difficult, maybe impossible. The Olmecs did not leave written records that the Aztecs could read and interpret. There was no continuous literary tradition connecting the two peoples across 18 centuries of cultural transformation, migration, and collapse. Whatever the Aztecs knew about the Olmecs, if they knew anything at all, would have come through oral tradition alone. Stories passed from generation to generation, shifting with each retelling, absorbing new meanings, shedding details that no longer made sense to later listeners. But oral traditions can preserve something. Not facts, exactly. Not precise historical accounts with dates and names and causal explanations. What they preserve is emotional truth, the shape of experience, the sense that something enormous happened, that the world changed, that people who seemed invincible were suddenly gone. Think about how memory works, even in your own life. You probably cannot remember exactly what you ate for lunch on a random Tuesday 10 years ago. But if something terrifying or transformative happened on that Tuesday, you remember the feeling of it forever, even if the specific details have blurred and shifted. Cultural memory works the same way, just on a much longer timescale. The names of forgotten kings dissolve. The specific causes of ancient catastrophes blur into something more symbolically comprehensible: floods, fires, storms sent by angry gods. But the core experience, the terrifying recognition that civilizations fall and worlds end, that survives, it gets refracted through centuries of retelling, embedded into cosmological frameworks, transformed from history into myth, but it does not disappear entirely. Something persists, a distorted echo maybe, a fragment of real experience wrapped in layers of symbolic interpretation so thick that the original event becomes almost impossible to identify. But the echo is still there, still carrying the emotional weight of whatever actually happened, still reminding anyone who hears it that the world they live in is not permanent, that the ground beneath their feet has shifted before and will shift again. The Aztecs may not have known the Olmecs by name. That term is a modern designation, invented by archaeologists based on the Nahuatl word for the people of the rubber-producing region. But they knew that someone had been here before them, someone enormous, someone whose works still stood incomprehensible and awe-inspiring, scattered across the land like monuments from a dream. And they knew, with the certainty born of seeing those ruins and hearing the stories passed down through countless generations, that whoever those people were, they were gone now. Their world had ended, just as Teotihuacan's world ended, just as Tula's world ended, just as every world must end. So we have these myths, these stories of worlds ending in jaguar fury, hurricane wind, fire from the sky, and endless water. Stories that echo across thousands of years, carrying the emotional weight of real collapses, real abandonments, real terror. But where does the specific imagery come from? Why fire and wind and rain and flood? Why these particular destroyers? The answer might be written in the landscape itself. Central Mexico is not a quiet place. It never has been. The Valley of Mexico, where the Aztecs ultimately built their empire, sits within a volcanic belt that stretches across the country like a scar. Two massive volcanoes dominate the southern skyline of the basin. Itztaccíhuatl, the sleeping woman, a dormant giant whose silhouette does indeed look like a reclining figure, and Popocatépetl, the smoking mountain. Popocatépetl has been active for hundreds of thousands of years. It erupts regularly. Even today, plumes of ash and gas rise from its crater, and periodic eruptions force nearby communities to evacuate. In the Aztec period, and for millennia before, Popocatépetl was an ever-present reminder that the earth holds forces capable of burying entire cities beneath ash and lava. And Popocatépetl is just the most visible example. The basin is surrounded by volcanic features. Zittel, a smaller cinder cone on the southern edge of the valley, erupted sometime around the 1st or 2nd century CE. That eruption buried an entire area beneath a massive lava flow, a black expanse of solidified rock known locally as the Pedregal. The lava field is still there today, a rugged wasteland of jagged basalt covering what had once been fertile agricultural land. Communities in this area had to relocate. The landscape itself was transformed. Now, it is entirely possible, though not certain, that the Zittel eruption contributed to the decline and relocation of settlements in the southern basin during that era, perhaps even affecting the trajectory of Quetzalcoatl, an important early centre that appears to have been largely abandoned around this time. Whether or not that specific connection holds, the point remains. People in this region lived with volcanoes. They watched eruptions. They saw ash darken the sky. They experienced the strange, terrifying phenomenon of volcanic ejecta raining down from above, hot fragments of rock and pumice falling like some perverse version of precipitation. Is it any wonder that the myth of the third sun, the age destroyed by fire from the sky, feels so vivid? That imagery of rain made of fire might not be pure poetic invention. It might be observation, experience translated into narrative. Then there are the earthquakes. The Aztec fifth sun, our current age, is called Nahui-Ollin, the age of movement, and the prophecy says it will end in movement, in earthquakes. Seismic activity in central Mexico is real and significant. The region sits near the intersection of tectonic plates, and the historical record includes numerous major quakes that damaged cities, shattered temples, and reshaped the terrain. The ground here does move, sometimes violently, sometimes without warning. The idea that our world will ultimately be destroyed by movement might reflect thousands of years of accumulated experience with unstable Earth, experiences that embedded themselves into cosmological thinking until the trembling ground became not just a local hazard, but a cosmic principle, the fundamental character of the era we inhabit. And then there is water. The basin of Mexico is unusual topographically. It is essentially an enclosed valley with no natural outlet for drainage. For millennia, this meant that water accumulated in the lowlands, forming a series of interconnected lakes, the largest of which was Lake Texcoco. This geography made the basin incredibly fertile and attractive for settlement, but it also made it vulnerable to flooding. Heavy rains could cause the lake levels to rise dramatically, inundating settlements along the shores. Seasonal flooding was a recurring challenge for every civilization that occupied the basin, including the Aztecs, who built their capital Tenochtitlan on an island in Lake Texcoco precisely because of the defensive advantages the water provided, but who also had to construct massive dikes and causeways to manage the lake's unpredictable fluctuations. The memory of great floods, of water overwhelming settlements, and forcing reconstruction or relocation was not abstract mythology for the peoples of the basin. It was lived reality, repeated across generations. So what we see in the Five Suns myths may be something more than pure symbolic storytelling. It may be a process of encoding. Communities that experience recurring disasters, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, need to do several things to survive. They need early warning. They need systems for recognizing precursors and responding before the catastrophe arrives. They need coping mechanisms, frameworks for making sense of devastating events that otherwise seem random and meaningless. And they need memory, ways of preserving crucial information about past disasters across generations so that future communities can prepare. Mythology might serve all these functions. Stories about gods sending fire from the sky, or angry deities unleashing floods, encode real observations about natural phenomena and their consequences. They create narrative structures that make disasters comprehensible, not just senseless destruction, but part of a larger pattern, a cycle, a cosmic order in which endings are as necessary as beginnings. And they preserve emotional memory, the terror and awe and grief that past disasters generated, ensuring that even generations who have not personally experienced a catastrophic eruption or flood still understand its power, still respect its possibility, still know that the world they inhabit can change violently and without mercy. This does not mean the Five Suns myths are simply disguised history. They are far more than that. They are sophisticated cosmological frameworks that address fundamental questions about existence, time, and human purpose. But they may also carry within their symbolic layers the accumulated weight of real experience. The ash that really fell from Popocatépetl, the quakes that really cracked temple walls, the floods that really rose from Lake Texcoco and swallowed shoreline settlements. Real disasters, wrapped in myth, transmitted across centuries as warnings and as wisdom. The earth moves, the sky burns, the waters rise. This is not just prophecy. It is memory, and it is perhaps a kind of survival technology, refined over countless generations, designed to ensure that the people who hear the stories never forget the most important lesson their ancestors learned the hard way. The world you live in is not permanent. It can end. And the only way to endure that truth is to build it into your understanding of reality from the very beginning. But here is where the story takes an even stranger turn. The Aztecs were not alone, not even close. When you start looking beyond Mesoamerica, beyond the valleys and volcanoes and lakes that shaped Nahua cosmology, you find something remarkable. The same patterns appearing in cultures that had no contact with each other, no shared geography, no way to exchange stories across oceans and continents. Multiple worlds, successive ages, cyclical creation and destruction. And above all the flood, the fourth sun of Aztec myth ended in water. The people of that age were transformed into fish, the mountains swallowed by endless waves, and the sky itself collapsed into the sea. It is a vivid, terrifying image. But if you travel halfway around the world, to the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, you find an eerily similar story. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of human literature, we encounter Utnapishtim, a man chosen by the gods to survive a great deluge. He builds a boat, seals it against the coming waters, gathers his family and animals, and endures a flood that destroys all of humanity. The parallels with the biblical story of Noah are impossible to ignore. A righteous man, divine warning, an ark, the survival of a remnant, the repopulation of a devastated world. Whether the Mesopotamian and biblical flood stories share a common origin through cultural diffusion across the ancient Near East is debated by scholars, but the structural similarities remain striking. A world undone by water, a few survivors, a new beginning. Now move east, far east, to the subcontinent of India and the vast cosmological frameworks of Hindu tradition. Here we find not just one flood, but an entire system of cyclical ages. The concept of the Yugas describes 4 distinct epochs, each with its own character, its own quality of human existence, its own trajectory toward decline. The Krita Yuga, the age of perfection. The Treta Yuga, when virtue begins to diminish. The Bevapara Yuga, a time of further decline. And finally the Kali Yuga, our current age, the era of conflict, spiritual darkness and decay. Each yuga lasts for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. And when the cycle completes, when the Kali Yuga reaches its terminus, the universe is destroyed and reborn. A new cycle begins, the cosmic wheel turns. This is not merely a story about a single catastrophe. It is a comprehensive philosophy of cosmic time, an understanding that existence itself moves through phases, that creation and destruction are not anomalies, but fundamental rhythms of reality. The Hindu tradition doesn't just describe past ages. It provides a map of all time, past and future, embedded in an infinite loop. And then there is Greece. Hesiod, the early Greek poet, wrote of the ages of man. 5 ages, not 4, but the pattern is unmistakable. First, the Golden Age, when humans lived in peace and abundance, unaware of suffering. Then the Silver Age, lesser in wisdom and virtue. Then the Bronze Age, a time of war and violence, when men destroyed themselves with their own weapons. Then the Heroic Age, a brief interruption, a window of nobility and glory, the age of the Trojan warriors. And finally, the Iron Age, Hesiod's own era, the worst of all, a time of toil, injustice, and despair. Each age gives way to the next through decline, through failure, through a kind of moral and physical deterioration that mirrors the cosmic collapses of Mesoamerican and Hindu tradition. The Greek version adds something important, though. The destruction comes not just from external forces, from floods or fire from the sky, but from within. Humans become the agents of their own age's ending. The catastrophe is self-inflicted. Cross the Atlantic again, but travel north to the deserts and mesas of the Hopi people in what is now the American Southwest. The Hopi tradition describes multiple worlds that existed before our own. 3 complete worlds, each destroyed when its inhabitants fell into corruption and spiritual imbalance. The first world ended in fire. The second world ended when the earth spun off its axis and everything froze. The third world ended in a great flood, and now we live in the fourth world, a time of danger and testing, a world that could also end if the people fail to live in proper harmony. The Hopi stories include details that feel uncannily familiar. A chosen survivor, instructions from a spiritual being, a journey from one world to the next, passing through a narrow opening to reach the new creation. The structural resonance with the Aztec 5 suns is profound. And yet the Hopi and the Nahua peoples were separated by thousands of miles of desert, mountain, and cultural difference. There is no straightforward historical connection that could explain the similarities. So what is happening here? Why do cultures scattered across the globe, separated by oceans and millennia, keep telling the same kind of story? 2 broad explanations have been proposed, and neither is entirely satisfying on its own. The first is diffusion, the idea that these myths spread from a common source, carried by migrating peoples, transmitted through trade routes and cultural contact, gradually adapting to local circumstances as they moved across the world. There is evidence for certain story elements moving between neighbouring cultures. The Mesopotamian flood narrative clearly influenced later biblical and possibly Greek traditions. But diffusion struggles to explain everything. How does a multi-age cyclical cosmology travel from Mesopotamia to the Hopi mesas without leaving traces across the intervening continents? How do the Yugas reach Mesoamerica? The second explanation is independent psychological and environmental origin. The argument that these myths arise separately in different cultures because they reflect universal human experiences and universal human anxieties. People everywhere observe the same natural phenomena. Floods, droughts, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, the slow decline of communities and civilizations. People everywhere grapple with the same existential questions. Why does suffering exist? Why do good times end? What happened before we were here? What will happen after we are gone? The human mind confronted with these questions and these observations might naturally generate similar narrative structures. Successive ages provide a way to organize time. Cataclysmic destruction provides a way to explain change. Survival and rebirth provide a way to maintain hope. Perhaps these patterns emerge not because cultures are copying each other, but because they are all trying to solve the same problems using the same cognitive tools. The truth probably lies somewhere between these two explanations, or perhaps includes both. Some myth elements diffused, others emerged independently. Some might have ancient roots so deep that they trace back to stories told by our bottleneck surviving ancestors, narratives carried out of Africa and dispersed across the globe before the three human species diverged. Others might have crystallized separately, born from local catastrophes and local imagination, converging on similar forms because the human relationship with disaster and time is fundamentally the same everywhere. We do not know for certain. What we do know is that the pattern is real. The mythic memory of multiple ages, of worlds before ours, of great floods and cosmic resets, is not a Mesoamerican invention. It is a human inheritance. So where does all of this leave us? Living in the fifth sun, the age of Nahui-Ollin, the age of movement. And here is the part that tends to make people uneasy. The Aztecs did not see this as a permanent arrangement. They believed our current world will also end, and they were very specific about how. The prophecy was clear. Nahui-Ollin will be destroyed by earthquakes, massive earth-shattering tremors that will tear the ground apart, collapse the mountains, and swallow everything into the abyss. The 4 previous suns had their elemental destroyers. Jaguars, wind, fire from the sky. Flood, our destroyer, is the earth itself, turning against us with violent seismic fury. This prophecy shaped everything about Aztec life. It created a profound religious urgency, a civilization operating under the weight of cosmic debt. If the 5th sun required divine sacrifice to begin, then it required continued sacrifice to keep moving. The sun was not some autonomous celestial engine. It was a fragile, struggling force that needed to be fed, nourished, sustained, with the most precious substance the Aztecs could offer: blood. The ritual sacrifices that dominate our modern perception of Aztec culture were not random acts of cruelty or primitive bloodlust. They were, in the Aztec worldview, the necessary maintenance of existence itself, a payment against the apocalypse. Every offering, every ceremony, every heart given to Tonatiuh on the temple pyramid was an attempt to postpone the earthquakes, to keep the world turning for one more day. Of course, you have probably heard a very different version of this story. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a strange cultural phenomenon emerged: the 2012 apocalypse craze. Books, documentaries, internet forums, all breathlessly predicting that December 21, 2012 would mark the end of the world, based supposedly on ancient Mesoamerican prophecy. It was a massive misappropriation. The Aztec prophecy of seismic destruction was completely ignored in favor of a completely different calendar system. The 2012 date came from the Maya long count calendar, specifically from a monument in the ancient Maya site of Tortuguero that referenced the completion of a major calendrical cycle. But completing a cycle is not the same as ending the world. It is more like watching an odometer roll over to a new set of zeros. The Maya themselves had no known prophecy connecting that date to global destruction, and the Aztec 5 suns tradition contained no specific date prediction at all. The earthquakes would come eventually, when the sun grew too weak to sustain movement, but no Aztec text ever said when. Yet these misappropriations keep happening, and there is a reason for that. Cyclical end-of-world myths remain deeply compelling to people today because they speak to something fundamental in the human psyche. We look at our own world, at the instability of ecosystems, at the tremors beneath seemingly solid institutions, and we feel an intuitive recognition. The understanding that our civilization, like every civilization before it, exists on borrowed time. These stories are not just ancient superstitions. They are frameworks for processing a truth that modern science confirms with increasing clarity. Our world is dynamic, volatile, and ultimately impermanent. The ground beneath us does move. The climate does shift. Everything we build exists within conditions that can and will change. So we circle back to where we began. 5 suns, 4 complete ages that rose and fell, each with its own people, its own sky, its own destruction. One age of darkness between the old world and the new. And now our age, Nahui-Ollin, sustained by sacrifice, destined for trembling. The Aztecs wove these eras together into one unified worldview. Not separate myths, but one continuous story, a cosmic trajectory running from the first clumsy giants through hurricanes, through raining fire, through the drowning of mountains, through the black void of no sun at all leading to this moment. US walking on a ground that could shake, living under a sun that was born from agony. The complete journey of the 5 suns is not a collection of disaster tales. It is a single philosophy of existence. Creation requires destruction. Survival requires debt, and every world, no matter how vibrant, carries within it the seeds of its own ending. We have walked through 4 complete worlds tonight. The age of giants devoured by jaguars, the age of hurricanes that swept everything into the void, the age of fire raining from the sky, turning people into birds just to survive, the age of endless water, drowning the highest peaks. Each world had its own people, its own sky, its own god presiding over the drama, and its own violent end. And then the darkness, that terrifying void between the 4th sun and the 5th, where the gods themselves had to gather at Teotihuacan, where Nanahuatzin had to leap into divine fire just to give us a dawn, where the heavens demanded even more blood just to make that newborn sun move across the sky. What does this entire journey reveal? Not just about the Aztecs, but about us. Because these stories are not museum artifacts locked behind glass. They are mirrors. The Aztec myth of the 5 suns is not really about jaguars or floods or divine rivalries. It is about impermanence. The understanding that nothing we build is permanent, that every golden age contains the conditions for its own collapse, that the very forces which sustain us, the sun, the rain, the stable ground beneath our feet, can also destroy us. This is a truth that modern science confirms with increasing clarity. Our climate is volatile, our tectonic plates shift, our ecosystems balance on razor edges. The Aztecs understood this centuries before seismographs and carbon dating. They wrapped that terrifying knowledge in stories of gods and monsters because that was the language they had. But the core insight was the same one we grapple with today. We live inside forces far larger than ourselves, and those forces do not promise us forever. But the story also reveals something else, something easy to miss when you are focused on all the destruction. Resilience. Every world ended, yes, but every world also began again. After the jaguars consumed the giants, the gods did not give up. They argued, they competed, they rebuilt, after the hurricanes shredded the earth. There was still enough raw material for a new creation. After the fire and the floods, there was still the possibility of dawn. Even in the darkest moment, the void with no sun at all, the gods gathered and found a way to ignite the heavens. The 5 suns is not ultimately a story about annihilation. It is a story about renewal, about the stubborn insistence of existence to keep trying, keep creating, keep starting over even when everything has been lost. That is the deeper current flowing beneath all the catastrophe. Not just that world's end, but that worlds begin. And this brings us to something larger than the Aztecs alone. Humanity across cultures and continents has returned again and again to the idea of cyclical time. Ages that rise and fall, worlds that live and die. The Hindus speak of yugas, vast cosmic epochs cycling through creation and dissolution. The Greeks told of golden ages descending into iron. The Norse imagined Ragnarok, a final battle that destroys the world but also plants the seeds for its rebirth. Flood myths appear in Sumerian tablets, in Genesis, in Chinese legend, in Polynesian tradition. Separated by oceans and millennia, human cultures keep arriving at the same essential framework. Time is not a straight line running from a beginning to a final end. It is a circle, or perhaps a spiral, where endings and beginnings are woven together, where destruction and creation are not opposites but partners in an ongoing dance. Why does this pattern appear everywhere? Perhaps because it matches what we actually observe. Seasons cycle, stars return. Forests burn and grow back. Civilizations collapse and new ones emerge from the ashes. We do not live in a universe of permanent stasis. We live in a universe of movement, of transformation, of constant becoming and unbecoming. The Aztec name for our age, Nahui-Ollin, the age of movement, captures this perfectly. We are not living in a fixed world, we are living in a process, an unfinished story. And that is where you find yourself right now, not at the end of something but in the middle, between two suns in a sense. The past is full of collapsed worlds, lost peoples, forgotten knowledge. The future holds transformations we cannot predict. You are here now, in this age, carrying the weight of all those previous endings and the uncertainty of whatever comes next. The Aztecs felt this weight profoundly. It drove their rituals, their sacrifices, their fierce commitment to keeping the sun moving. We feel it too, even if we express it differently. The question of what we owe to existence, what we must give to keep the world turning, what sacrifices our age demands of us, that question has not gone away. It has only changed form. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this. You are part of an ongoing, unfinished story that stretches back through 4 destroyed worlds, through divine rivalries and cosmic sacrifices, through flood and fire and void, all leading to this moment, this age of movement, where the ground beneath you is alive and the sky above you was born from agony. The Aztecs looked at that reality and chose to meet it with ritual and offering. We look at it and choose to meet it with science and storytelling. But the underlying recognition is the same. We are not permanent. Our world is not guaranteed, and yet we persist. We keep building, keep creating, keep telling stories about stories, because that is what survivors of fallen worlds do. That is what living between 2 suns means. If this journey through the 5 suns has kept you company tonight, I would be genuinely grateful if you liked this video, left a comment, and subscribed to the channel. It helps more than you might realize, and I would love to know, where are you listening from right now? What corner of this 5th sun are you resting in as these ancient stories wash over you? Drop a comment and let me create a map of all the places these myths reach. Finally, if you want the best way to support this channel and help more people find these stories, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description. Spotify support makes a real difference in keeping these deep dives into history and myth alive, and available for everyone seeking them out. Sleep well tonight, fellow traveller in the age of movement. The ground is quiet for now, the sun will rise again tomorrow, and the story continues.